We are live.
We did it. Hello, Patricia Berry.
Hello, Jessica Letaw.
And hello to our friends in the onlines. Patricia, as you may notice if you've been following along the last few weeks, is out in the world. And so she can see us, but nothing else. So I'm going to kick us off here. First, we'll introduce ourselves and each other, and then I'll go into the working agreements for the session. So, hello, my name is Jessica Letaw. I first discovered I was a white woman about 10 years ago and have been working on kind of unraveling what that means ever since. And my absolute favorite way to do that is in community with other white people, and like white women are my favorite folks to talk to about this, because we share kind of that intersection of patriarchy and race. And that leads me to my lovely person here.
Hello, I'm Patricia Berry. I'm a free range fundraising consultant, a cis hetero white woman who specifically came to this work because I guess I shouldn't say specifically. One of the reasons that I came to this work is because I really started to open my eyes to what sharing wealth was doing in the fundraising world to contribute to white supremacy, patriarchal thinking, all of that stuff. That when sharing wealth is done in a healthy way and an equitable way, it can be really transformative to communities. But I wasn't working in those spaces. And so, one of the things that I feel called to do in uprooting my own white centered thinking and my own racism is to think about how to better share wealth in communities to really empower us all. So, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Mm, thank you. Yes. Also, she, her, hers. Cis, queer, uh, advanced education, and a various other hodgepodge of identities, which we've talked about before and we'll continue to talk about together. So, Patricia and I have been in collaboration and loving community for a long time. She and I have done a lot of conversations privately and to some extent in community around race. And Patricia was the one who discovered the White Women book when it came out and said she really wanted to have a conversation about that. And I decided to just parachute into her thing. And so now we're both here, which I'm very glad about. One of the things that we wanted to do to help these conversations be as deep and as brave as they can be is to set up working agreements. So we have an understanding of what kind of the bumpers are around our conversation. So as we usually do, I will bring those up on the screen and I'll talk a little bit about them. Okay. All right. So the first one is that we put aside the right to comfort. We the importance of that is that this world is not a safe world, and so this learning, we're not doing service to it if we try to make it safe. So in this space we invite each other to loving accountability. um, we love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up mirrors that need holding up, because we acknowledge that kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive. The second one is that we ask for the speed that we need. And that's specifically, even though we're putting aside the right to comfort, there are certain things that you need in order to be able to process something. You need space. For me, I often need time. Um, and I am constantly kind of negotiating what is comfort and what is safety around the speed conversation. So that's something that I'm in active dialogue with myself about. But I would like to invite us to ask for the pace that we need. It helps to go a little slower to onboard new ideas, and mainly just kind of inviting ourselves and each other the time that we need to think and speak is really useful. The third one is to resist binary thinking, to stay away from dichotomies and lean into the nuance as much as possible. Right and wrong, either or, staying away from those helps us lean into the nuance of the histories that we're trying to address, and the presents and the futures that we're trying to build. And then the last working agreement is that we welcome conflict. In dominant culture in the Midwest, where Patricia and I live, as women, pick an identity, really. We are often rewarded for being nice instead of being real, and for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement. So in this space, we invite each other to allow a lot of emotional space to be in conflict with each other, in conflict with the ideas being presented, and in conflict even with ourselves.
And one of the things that Jess and I are hoping for with this series is that not only is it us talking about ideas that are sparked from reading this book, but also giving an example of how other white women who want to do this kind of unlearning might approach a loving and accountable conversation with another white woman to do this work. So it's not just what we're talking about, but the ways that we're trying to create both for ourselves and potentially for others to think about how to do this work in community in a way that's meaningful and not Band-Aid like or performative.
No, all totally true. That is, we are doing the things that we want, and we are modeling the things that we want to see, and also struggling with the things that we're trying to model. Speaking for myself, I'll talk about that a little bit in this session. But man, this material keeps coming back to first person relationships, and that is, and it would be so much easier if we were just book clubbing this, not trying to change ourselves or our lives. Okay, so the next thing that we've been doing in our last conversations that frankly I've really come to look forward to is our White Lady check-in, just kind of talking a little bit about whiteness, how whiteness has shown up for us this week. So Patricia, can I invite you to be the first?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to hopefully not just continue to lean on this, but I am traveling. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking a lot about my whiteness in traveling. Going on the road, we're driving, me and my partner, who is also a white male. Our sense of boldness and safety and security, as well as comfort in spaces. One of our goals that we often have when we're traveling around is how can we support Black-owned businesses wherever we go? But a lot of times we'll go places because, like in Rhode Island, my family is in Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. Rhode Island is 76% white. Mm-hmm. And it's been a while since I've been in a state that is that just across the board. Because one of my things that I was noticing is we're going into coffee shops that it is all white people. Mm-hmm. And, why is that? And what's happening? And, Rhode Island has a troubled history in the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And you're definitely seeing some of that referred to, like we were in Westerly, Rhode Island, and there's a local bookstore that I think has done a very good job curating a terrific selection of books that is clear-eyed in what they're presenting as historical accuracy of their participation in the slave trade, but it's also from a very strong level of comfort. Like, we're all just white people saying, wow, Rhode Island really has a crazy history. Mm-hmm. They're in no way confronting on a daily basis the intersection of their own racism by encountering people who don't look like them. So I think that's what I continue to think about. I'm going to be on the road for another 7 days, traveling back to Ypsilanti, is to just think about where my privilege essentially meets the road. Mm-hmm. That's my White Lady check-in for the moment.
I gotta say, I read Finding Me this year, and now the only thing Rhode Island means to me is Viola Davis. So, I take your point that the state is 76% white, but not in my head. So,
yeah, I think it was 8.9% Black, and then there was various other races represented. But yeah, it's overwhelmingly white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, race came up, whiteness came up a lot. really in a lot of work situations and in a lot of like relationship interactions, I think the one that stood out for me, that I wanted to bring into this space was, I am in, I'm trying to keep this book specific enough that it, like all the relevant details come in, and anonymous enough that I'm not telling other people's stories. Um, but I'm in a community group with a bunch of different folks that's intentionally diverse. We are intentionally working on reckoning with racist and racialized histories. So there is a level of complexity, intentionally already in the room and kind of built into the work that we're doing. And all of our personalities, all of our identities are also at play. So it's not just this kind of dry historical academic work that we're doing. Who we are is implicated in all of the work that we do. And there's, right now, one of the primary leaders is, I thought that was a really interesting frog. Thank you. It's okay. It is a frog, just in the air, and not a frog. It's a helicopter. Got it. It's okay.
I'm on Roosevelt Island in New York, and I'm in one of the highest towers, and we
Mhm.
just had a flyover. I feel like every time I'm on this, I'm always apologizing for some sort of noise issue. It's me. It's me. I'm the
I'm
problem.
the
I'm
problem. It's
sorry.
me. It's all good. I mean, I'd rather have the beagle, but helicopters are also fine. So, one of the leaders of this group is a biracial man who is working to curate complex work, complex people, and kind of keep us moving forward. And one of the challenges is that he is deeply conflict averse, like deeply conflict averse, and because of the power identities that that he holds, that is a tolerable position for him. Like there's not a whole lot to move him off the comfort hill, even when conflict is needed to kind of move the work forward. So he and I have been talking a lot about generative conflict within the group, about what's coming up, what isn't coming up, what should be coming up, and how to move some specific things forward. And I try to be always mindful of my, identity as a white woman working on racialized histories. It is important that my voice is not the front voice in the room, but he often asks for, excuse me, advice, perspective, thoughts in my brain, whatever. There was a few interactions this last week that really troubled me, and some of them I talked about with him, some of them I didn't. And I was talking about all of this with another person who was in the group, this time a Black person. And I said, this person that I've been talking to, he's really going through a lot, he's a really nice guy. And they stopped me and they were like, that is actually not relevant to this conversation. And I had been thinking about niceness. We have been talking about niceness a lot. I'd been thinking about niceness in terms of interaction, and I'm not sure I'd made the connection about how we write off certain things because of nice people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but indirectly. And in this context, I totally missed it. And when they cut me off, like, I definitely felt like my nose was bumped a minute, like my body was in it. And I'm still sitting with that. And what they said was, the conflict that I didn't surface is more urgent and more relevant than the fact that this man is nice. And that is correct. And I'm frustrated with myself for like not seeing it in the first pass. But that's one of the ways that whiteness came up for me, is that I realized that I write niceness checks,
Mm-hmm.
that are passes for things.
I felt like in the last really large institution that I worked in that was problematic on so many levels, the individuals that I felt like were the most problematic were the nice white guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That they somehow got a pass. And if I brought something up that was a complaint or a question or whatever, it always reverted back to, but so and so nice,
Yeah.
that how could he possibly,
Mm-hmm.
intend X, Y, or Z? Well, I
Mm-hmm.
don't care whether he's nice or what he intended, but the impact of the thing was this. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like I mean, I feel like that's another one of those categories that we don't necessarily unpack all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is the nice white dudes,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that that aspect of niceness is not really, it's not really relevant to what is actually happening here. If anything, it's a distraction. I think it's a performative distraction from
It
actually doing the work.
And I think you're exactly right. It's a performative distraction from actually doing the work. And there's a part of me, I didn't know you were in New York. I know you were in New York. There's a part of me that, because I'm examining, like, why didn't I say something at the time? Because I felt it. I knew it. Like, it wasn't even a prickling of my intuition. I knew what was happening. I wanted to be friends. I wanted to be liked, right? Like, it's more complicated than that, but also.
And if everybody likes the nice white guy,
yeah.
and I'm complaining about the nice white guy,
yeah.
or complaining to the nice white guy, you know, more direct, asking, calling on him, calling on him to do better.
Yeah.
I'm not nice.
Yeah. And just a reminder, like, this is a biracial person, which made it more complicated, right? Like, I'm just, he and I are both negotiating our many complex identities. They hold institutional power, they hold class power, they hold gender power, right? Like, they hold all of these powers, and because of that aversion to conflict, enable harm in the group.
And truthfully, don't let other people progress as well.
Yep, 100%. 100%. Yes.
So I'm kind of thinking of some of the research that's being done right now around not giving feedback, adequate feedback, because you're afraid, if you're a white manager, from giving adequate and real feedback to a Black employee, because you are concerned, right? You're
afraid. Say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have done work unpacking your internalized racism, you can walk that line. I don't know that I'm ever going to feel like I got it 100% right every time, but you can walk that line between knowing what you need to do professionally and continuing to back out the biases, the biased language, like the biased checks. We all want to be encouraged to do better. We want to live up to expectations, not down to them. And when we as white folks have not done our internalized work, we're not doing a service to any of the folks around us, above, below, or at the same level.
Or being myself sensitive about criticism.
Yeah.
It's limiting myself. It's limiting my growth just because that hurt.
Yes. Yeah.
Ow.
Yeah. We do. We talk about that nose bump, right? We've talked in past sessions about how there are a lot of folks. I'll speak for myself. There have been times when I've been afraid to do this work because I didn't want to get it wrong, and it took.
And I didn't want to get it wrong publicly.
I didn't want to get it wrong publicly. I didn't. Mine was because of what I do. I get shit wrong publicly on a regular basis. It doesn't stop hurting, but it's a little bit of an occasional habit now. My tightness was around, I didn't want to get it wrong with my precious relationships. And what I didn't realize was that in order to be deeply in intimate relationship with people, I have to get it wrong. That is absolutely a part of the process, because I need to be able, A, to be honest, which means some of my internalized biases are going to come out, and B, I need to be able to come back from when I cause harm, when I inevitably cause harm. I need to demonstrate that I can learn, I can take the feedback, I can feel hurt that someone I cherish corrects me, and sit with it, be grown up enough to sit with it, and then transform that into, again, a deeper, more loving relationship.
No matter how old I get, I'm always going to have some grown-upness that I still need to be pursuing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can go back a little bit to a reference that you made about calling on. So that was something that you had talked about maybe bringing into this conversation. And can you please?
Oh, yeah. So I put in the comments for this link so you can see the link to it. And it's Sonia Renee Taylor. She wrote a wonderful book called The Body Is Not an Apology. And somebody who I've been following for a long time.
Was she the one who wrote Pleasure Activism, or was that Adrienne Marie Brown?
That was, I believe, Adrienne Marie Brown, but I
Okay.
wouldn't know without consulting the Googles for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so she did. I don't know if it's a TikTok video or it's out there in the world, talking about the concept of calling out versus calling in versus calling on. And the way that she illuminates it for herself is the amount of labor that you're doing, personal labor, and the amount of just get off my foot, I think is the term that she uses. So calling out in her construction is a bit of a cuss out. It's, you're standing on my foot, you've done something hurtful, I need you to get off the foot. And I am not willing to do emotional labor in this case. I just need you to stop. Like, I recognize I'm not going to change you. Calling in is labor that she would do for people that she cares about, that she wants to be in community with, and that she would be willing to offer a little education and perspective. And then she develops this third term, which she started using lately, called calling on, right? So I am calling on you to do some learning. I'm calling on you to do some work so that we can be in this beloved community together. But it's somewhere between, those two spaces, right? Like, it's not a ton of emotional work, but it's a noticing, I'm noticing.
And I think, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
No, I was interrupting.
I don't know that I had much more to say about it, but I think what I like about that is you don't have to go terribly deep, but you're pointing out to somebody that there's some work that they need to do. And one of the reasons that I think that's a nice educational thing is because people don't often remember or internalize something that you say to them, but they will remember and internalize something that they discover on their own. So a calling on, like I call on you to look at this, is just inviting somebody to take that moment, and then they decide. They decide whether they want to take that moment or not. So yeah, that's what I have been kind of thinking about with the, one of the things I do struggle with in this work is not wanting to shame people. Like, I do want to
I know
get
that's
rid
really
of
important to you.
nice.
Yeah,
It is. It's something that I grew up with, that I was shamed for being intelligent. I was I was shamed for using big words. I was shamed for all sorts of things, just being who I was in the world. And I don't want that to be part of my work. I do recognize that sometimes you just need somebody off your foot. They deserve it. Like, dude, off my foot. But I would love my work to include, and the people that I'm in community with, a middle way. And I feel like this is one of those middle ways. So I don't know. What did you think about that?
I appreciated you posted that link as a comment on the LinkedIn thread for this conversation, and so I took a few minutes to watch it. It wasn't long; it was less than around 6 minutes long. Definitely worth the time because I have been thinking a lot about it ever since I watched it. So she said at the I took a couple of notes on it. She said at the top of the conversation, we don't create distinctions around the reason that we are communicating. And so there may be a criticism coming, and we just sort of blanket it as this is a criticism, and we don't distinguish it. So calling out, she distinguishes it. Sure, she characterizes it as I have been harmed. I'm not necessarily invested whether you learn or not. Like, you might not. That's not what I'm about. Like you said, you stepped on my foot. Ow, get off my foot. The second one, calling in, was I am invested in your learning. You and I are in relationship, and so I am invested in walking through this learning with you because it's important to me that you get it. Calling on, I don't think she would view it as a middle way, because the way that she described it was it removes positionality from it. It does not state my position relative to your behavior. I do not claim harm in this. I am claiming that this behavior is not a behavior that's consistent with the community that you and I are trying to build together. So I'm calling on you to examine your own behavior. Or whatever it is. I love that, like the positionality thing of like, what is my relationship to the statement and not necessarily my direct relationship to you. I thought was a beautiful nuance to offer that. And a part of the reason that I was so glad you brought this in is that, as somebody who's been in organizing and movement and justice work for a while, I don't know a single person that hasn't spent an obsessive amount of time thinking about calling out versus calling in, the role of shame. Like, how are you helping people see something differently so that they do something differently? And I also want to bring in something that Brene Brown said a couple of years ago. I've watched a little bit her conversation around the role of shame in these conversations evolve. For a long time, she said there is no room for shame in, discourse. She basically said if you're using shame, then you are not having a conversation. A couple of years ago, she said something, and I don't know that this was a pivot, but I think it was a nuance, where she said, if I say something and then you feel shame because of it, that is actually not on me.
Mm-hmm.
As the meme goes, that sounds like a you problem. And I thought that was a useful nuance. And in the South, especially in Southern Baptist Church, we call this being convicted, like something sits on your heart. Like, if that hurts for you, that is not a me thing. That's a you.
Mm-hmm. I really like your addition of the nuance of positionality that, yeah, I heard in that, but I don't think I quite internalized it until you talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it even more compelling to me as a tool,
Mm-hmm.
right? So one of the things that you and I started these two chapters with was neither one of us have children.
Oh, yes, that's important to name. The
Right?
chapter
So
about
we
white
have a
mothers, we are not.
positionality
Right.
in this learning that we are going to get some knowledge. It has an effect on our work. It has an effect on our community. But I'm not necessarily like particularly knowledgeable or insightful around a child in school.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly, see parents in my community and have thoughts about the different ways that they're doing parenting, but I'm not a parent. I don't know what any of that is.
Mm-hmm.
But there could be things that I may offer to call on somebody else without saying, let me tell you your business. Does that make sense in the calling on kind of situation?
Yes.
That,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm not personally affected by that, but I do have some information. I'm calling on you
Mm-hmm.
to find additional learning or meaning or whatever in this. Because I did, as obviously any community I live in, schools have a big part of, but I'm not going there every day. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
the ins and outs of the whole shenanigan.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that as a nuance. I think that was the point of that whole story.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a different kind of tool
Mm-hmm.
that white women talking to white women in particular
Mm-hmm.
may use it as a tool
Mm-hmm.
without claiming the positionality of, something I'm not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Certainly racism has an effect on my life, a
Mm-hmm.
detrimental effect on my life, but I can never claim to be marginalized with a Black identity.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like a really good tool for me.
That feels like a nice segue into some of the material in the chapters. So we decided to do 2 chapters this week for a couple of reasons. One, it wraps us up very nicely before Memorial Day. We're all welcome. And 2, these were relatively short chapters, and I will say short and not super dense. So it felt manageable to be able to read these 2 together. And after having read that, I affirm that decision. I'm going to bring in my first criticisms of the book into these 2 chapters. Chapter 5 is specifically on entitlement. Chapter 6 is on, I want to get the full title of this because it was a little bit longer. Is this right? No, flipped too far. How schools and white mothers uphold white supremacy. So in the entitlement chapter, my two criticisms are I wanted more. I wanted so much more in this chapter. I know that Syra and Regina feel like niceness is kind of the heartbeat, the beating heartbeat of white women's upholding of racism. And I think that there's a lot to that. But I think the expression of that, really kind of the umbrella description for it, is entitlement. And I was hungry for a lot more examples in here. You know, they're the authors, they're writing from their experience, and so they get to decide how they bring it forward. So rather than criticize what isn't in the chapter, the one that I'll specifically name is on pages 67 and 68. Syra does list 3 examples, what she calls casual examples of your white woman entitlement. And 2 of the 3 examples are about children. And I can't tell in reading this whether the behaviors of white children that they're criticizing, that they criticize of all children, or they're critical because Black and brown children are not free to engage in those without censure, punishment, or harm. And if it's the latter, it feels like it's coming from a position of scarcity that is not consistent with what I want to build. And what I'm saying is, I don't think we should be saying white kids don't do this. I think we should be saying parents in situations, please make sure that the Black and brown children in your spaces are safe and that you are being safe with them, that you are not overly policing their behaviors. So that was my largest criticism of chapter 5. A, I wanted a lot more, and B, there was a fundamental assumption in the material that if I'm reading it the way that I'm reading it, I didn't agree with.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When we were having kind of our pre-conversation about this, I didn't pick up on a lot of that stuff, and I think it is because I'm, 55 years old and I'm not around a ton of children. Mm-hmm. I had somebody tell me this weekend that I was very brave to never have children. I was like, that's a interesting, not that's compliment. So the point of that story is I missed that nuance, but I also think it was a little bit me white centering. Like I wasn't necessarily thinking about Black and brown children. I was thinking about the criticism of white parents and white children. And when you kind of pointed that out, I was, oh, that's kind of like how are we caring for all the children equitably that we come into contact with, right?
And I guess I should say, it's not just the scarcity abundance thing. I guess this is also coming down to a value that I hold, which is a craving for children to be allowed to be messier in the spaces that they occupy, that we are not trying to create perfect citizens, that we're trying to create full human beings. And that's true of all of us, including us not parents. And so, like, it felt like the criticism was of the children as well as the parents. And I had some resistance to that, had and have some resistance to that. But that may be a nuance in the language that they just didn't bring in. If we're going to talk about criticisms, I want to come into chapter 6. Oh my God, it's like lightning in here. It's my whiteness. It actually throws off the light. So if I'm in the wrong place in the room, the light doesn't know how to read me. Okay. So chapter 6, and I'm feeling a little bit of heaviness about this because while we welcome conflict, I actually really don't want to criticize this book. I don't have the author's experiences. I don't have their goal for writing this book and choosing the material they put in this. And as Patricia has mentioned, neither one of us are parents. But there's a criticism of this chapter that I cannot look away from, which is the title is How Schools and White Mothers Uphold White Supremacy. You do not need to have read the book to engage in these conversations, but if you read this chapter, you may have noticed that they actually did not talk about white mothers at all. What they talked about were white educators and white administrators, and how their behaviors in schools, whether public or private, have adverse impacts and are often outright abusive to Black, Indigenous, and other educators and administrators of color, and to students in those spaces as well. Valid criticism. We need those stories. And I got the feeling from the book that they actually edited out a lot. They said they did a number of interviews with educators of color, and they only told one story. And I imagine that that was a lot to hold, because the one that they put in there was pretty rough. But they did not talk about white mothers. And in the spaces that I'm in, I organize around housing justice, but you cannot talk about housing justice, especially racially, without talking about neighborhoods, and you cannot talk about neighborhoods without talking about schools, like hand in hand. One racializing one 100% racializes the other. It's a causal relationship, and it goes both ways. And so not to talk about white mothers, especially when that's one of the titles of the chapter, felt like a huge, huge, monumental omission to me. One example, just one, is in public schools. It's April 24th and it's snowing in Michigan, y'all. In public schools, how schools are funded in a district, that allocation, I think, is decided at the state level, and it's accorded by school district. So I live in Ann Arbor. We have an Ann Arbor public school district. Every student gets so many dollars, from the state according to our taxes. But then there's a PTO for each school, and the PTO fundraises, and those tend to go towards materials, programs, and extracurricular activities for that school. So you may have kids at a school that has a robotics program and takes a trip to Alabama every year, takes one of their grades to Alabama every year to see the rockets in person. Or you may be part of a school that struggles to be able to rent buses to get to the local museum. And those are two specific examples from local schools. And so I think the omission of white mothers and their role in funding, in advocacy, in moving like teachers and administrators from place to place based on their complaints and their sensitivities, that it needed to be in this book. And I think that it's the poorer for it that it wasn't.
When we were talking about this, I keep thinking about that call to action that Cad Smith, one of my teachers, made about what are you really willing to risk to confront your own racism? Like, what are you willing to have it cost you? And this is one of those places, parents and their kids, white parents and their white kids, that we are willing to risk nothing to be in public schools, right? Even so, I'm in Ypsilanti, which is much poorer than Ann Arbor. There's a couple of flagship, I don't know what you'd call them, magnet schools, I think they call them.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And it's where the white parents who are performatively sending their kids to public school, that's where they will put their kids. Yeah. We have one called the International School, and it's everything's special about it. It's a public school, but everything's special. And then we have, the school down the road that just is really, can't hardly, keep the heat on. Like, it's a mess. There's huge dead spaces. And so again, this is a calling on, because, what would I do? I don't know what I would do if my kid was going to a school that I felt like was so deeply underperforming that their life may be negatively affected. But why would I be willing to let other kids do that? So that goes back to your comment about we should really be talking about how we're keeping kids safe. Like, what are we willing to risk? White parents in particular, very little.
Yep. They're like, look, I will do anything out in the world that you want me to, but when it comes to my child, I'm not going to risk that. And risk is defined a lot of different ways, but they are often proxies for something that's racialized. And that's difficult to look at. And for the white parents I know that are genuinely trying to do this work, like internal change that translates to world change, they struggle with it too, because you can make a decision for your child that supports the system that you wish existed but didn't, and it doesn't change that system. It really doesn't, you know. And
Because
so,
not
like,
everybody's
what?
doing it. And
Right. And
nobody,
so,
not if we
what are you really
all
doing?
did it, if we all agreed,
Mm-hmm.
the schools will
Mm-hmm.
be well funded because everybody's going to be committed to the schools.
If we fundraised PTOs at a district level instead of a school level, like, what if we did that? But I tell you what, that is a non-starter in most rooms, because parents know that, especially white parents know, and middle class parents know, if we fund at a district level, my kid will get less. Intuitively, they know that, and intuitively, they know why.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm feeling some angst around this, and part of that is the material, and part of that, again, I wish it had been in the book, because I wish that we could have, like, had this conversation more holistically. So what I will offer to folks who and white parents in the audience and in the conversation, and folks who may want to understand white parents' point of view, I would encourage us to listen to a 5-part reportage podcast put on by the New York Times called Nice White Parents. Here is a short description from their own website. Excuse me. When Hannah Jaffe Walt, a reporter, looked at inequality in education, she saw that most reforms focused on whose schools were failing Black and brown kids. But what about who the schools are serving? In this 5-part series, she turns her attention to what is arguably the most powerful force in our schools, white parents. And to me, she made a very compelling case for the need to examine the role of white parents in funding, in advocacy, in staffing, you know, in program and curricula, like in all of this. So my call on, for me, if you're a white parent, if you care about children, like whatever it is, whether your kids are in public or private schools, this podcast is mandatory listening if you haven't already. That's my call on. I call on you to listen to it and to identify which of the practices identified in the podcast series are happening at your kids' schools right now. That I ask you to do that. I call on you to do that. I beg you to do that. Please, please, please. We need to be clearer-eyed and looking at how we're engaging in communally our kids' education. One of the points that they make in the book, which I absolutely believe, and I don't want to diminish it, is the point that the curriculum is often very white-centric, unexamined, being taught by majority white teachers. All important points, absolutely. And the fact that these points are often reinforced at home by white parents and white children, a pipeline that we can't ignore. And please listen to Nice White Parents if you haven't already, and look at your kid's school and describe for yourself what's happening at your kid's school right now. Man, I just really needed to say that, because I am hungry for a community, all of our communities, a community that is so healthy that it cannot help but do good things for our children. And the omission of, like, that, and straight look at white mothers, it hurt. It hurt. Big feelings, man.
Big feelings. And just as I kind of sit with these, connecting these two conversations, right? So ungovernable kids, who's allowed to be ungovernable in a childhood sense, and nice white parents and nice white schools. I'm going to get back to one of my kicks, which this just feels like we are putting kids through the grinder of capitalism.
Yeah.
Which is racist. You know, that only, you know, we need bodies to kind of like work the machines, right? So that capitalism works. And I I still haven't fully made the connections, but for some reason, both of those things are just kind of resonating with me.
I appreciate you giving me the space to kind of work some of that out, because I had specific expectations about what this chapter would be, and I had big feelings in the wake of it. And you know, our first and fourth working agreements are no right to comfort. So I'm sitting with my outrage, which is definitely what I felt, and something that I try to work very hard. I try to look at very hard when I feel it. And number four, crap, what's the fourth one?
Conflict.
Conflict. I don't actually want to be in conflict with the book, but in these two chapters I am.
But I think we're allowed to not question people that we respect.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't serve any of us.
Right. Right.
But it is interesting to think about what criticisms I would be willing to offer. I go back to that. I'm listening and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm using that too much as a cop-out from participating in conflict sometimes. You know, it doesn't have to be conflict, but yeah. I think it's a good book that can spark that many feelings and thoughts.
Yeah. And generative, it is generative conflict for me, even with the book. I wonder if I can pivot to something that you and I both, that was not named in this chapter, but you and I both resonated with, a specific concept of time. I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned last time that I'm doing the Race to Community work. So there is a cohort of, I think there's 9 of us, other white women who are in a cohort, and we meet every Sunday for a few hours, and we do homework in between, and some of it is generated by this book and some of it is other stuff. But I am consistently finding those conversations to be very collaborative, and it's a wonderful and brave space, I think, to do the work. So one of the things that came out this Sunday from one of my cohort members, Katie, hey Katie, I know you're out there, was we were talking about time. And Jess, you know this from working with me, when we create working agreements for nonprofit boards, any board, one of the biggest complaints we get from board members, and when boards start falling apart, is when people don't show up on time. And time in general, I will say, I'm totally a child of capitalism in that I have a lot of feelings about being on time. And I really had to sit with that very deeply.
Because it feels like being a good person, right? Like one way of being a good person is being on time. Am I understanding that?
No.
Okay.
Not for
Awesome.
me. For me, it's a little bit more like, you're wasting my time.
I see.
You're devaluing me by not showing up on the time that we agreed. And I have very little time to spend, and I chose to spend it with you, and then you did this. And, you know, particularly, you know, I'm a consultant, and I come from, you know, both fundraising as well as a fundraising consulting background. You know, like, time for me is like, there is an hourly rate associated with that. And there's somebody on the other end of this hour that I am responsible for, that I have to show up for. And then there's all sorts of personal feelings about it. You know, even in my private time, if you're not showing up on time, or if I'm not showing up on time, like, it says something about our care for each other, certainly. But I think in my mind, right, if this is like, if I'm unpacking kind of what is that ingrained thing, it's that you're not honoring what I have carved out for you. And as I've worked more and more in rooms that are not 100% white, which I had for years and years and years, time is actually a topic of conversation. Not being on time is seen as, it's just what we do. Like sometimes they start on time, sometimes we don't start on time. And I struggle with it. And I struggle with the fact that I am being called on to reconceptualize my feelings about time based on communities that I'm now involved in. It's anti-capitalist, it's anti-white supremacy, it dings all the buttons, but I have to say there's a little piece in my heart that still can't get over it. So those are my feelings. Oh, so the point that I was going to make, Katie made this wonderful point, because we were talking about, we were creating group values. And we have this Zoom call on Sunday, and there's parents in there, and there's people with aging loved ones, and there's all these things that we have to do on Sunday, and can we arrive on time for each other? And we had this great conversation about, what does time mean? Like, does that mean that we are enacting for ourselves concepts of white supremacy, hallmarks of white supremacy? And so Katie gave us a great reframing that I'm still sitting with, because I don't quite know how to use it. But she asked, can you separate time, being on time, punctuality, perhaps is a better way to put it. Can you separate punctuality from commitment? And I'm still sitting with that, right? So if I separate punctuality from commitment, how does that move things for me? So based on that word vomit.
It was all necessary. Like, I'm just sitting with it. And again, as someone who's known you for a long time, I know some of your relationship to time. I'm coming to understand that there's a lot of iceberg to that tip. But I am also observing that in our friendship, when I'm late to commitments that you and I have, I think subconsciously trained myself not to explain why I'm late, because I don't want to tell you that another commitment was more important than you, because that isn't never the case. It's never, ever, ever the case. There may be a reason, but the reason wasn't because something was more important. It's generally because I got in the way of my own logistics. I am a magical thinker when it comes to time. So I think it's really interesting. I'm learning something about our relationship as I'm listening to you talk, and loving that very much. I'm thinking a bit about, I have a book. It is over there, so I'm not going to go get it. Written by Ari Weinzweig, who is a founder and co-owner of a series of businesses locally called Zingerman, the Zingerman's Community of Businesses. And he writes business books that have become increasingly beliefs books, which I absolutely love. And in his third book, Managing Ourselves, I bought that the year that I went to work for myself, because I was like, I have managed people. I don't know that I've ever managed myself effectively. And he has a whole chapter on time. And the way where he starts that chapter is describing the history of our current concept of time, and locates it squarely with the evolution of the Industrial Revolution, right? Like, we needed shifts. We needed to know exactly how many minutes a person was at a piece of equipment, how many minutes the equipment was working. And so our Western concept of time right now was really coded then. And so for several years now, I've had this concept of time, including punctuality, although to a lesser degree, as artificial, as a construct. That is absolutely as a construct. And how we interpret time, I'm increasingly coming to understand, is how we interpret our relationships. It's not to say that the o'clock doesn't matter. Like, I made sure to hit live on this broadcast at 6:00 and not a minute after. But I do think that there's a richness there to explore. I love that came up in your dinner. And I love that it came up about an offering, an invitation really came to expand from valuing punctuality to valuing connection. And I think that feels powerful and rich and full of possibility.
Yeah. I still don't know where I'll end up with it.
It doesn't matter.
It's
This is where you
so
are
deeply
today.
ingrained.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you where our conversation landed
Mm-hmm.
was compassion if people couldn't show up and they didn't require an excuse. Like we don't require an excuse.
Yeah.
You show up when you can,
Yeah.
but we will end on time.
Mm-hmm.
So how we decide to use our 3 hours together is really up to you, and how you decide to carve out your day is up to you. And then we will all end on time so that we can kind of go off to our. And the other thing that we ended up with is, rather than stopping the meeting to backtrack for people who arrived late, is one person would deputize themselves to bring a latecomer up to speed privately in the chat. We're all on Zoom in these things. So it was a rich discussion, because you and I, have worked on this concept of how do you get boards, nonprofit boards in particular, with the right motivation and the right kind of sense of purpose, right? And I thought that was,
and if you're doing it right, the people you pick are really busy.
Exactly. Like they are dedicated to their calendar, and if you're not, doing X, Y, or Z, they won't show up anymore because you're not valuing their time. But I think it's interesting to have this, if I have another board conversation, to add the nuance of this, right? That, time is an invention of the Industrial Revolution, and it's created to commodify us. And, there's all sorts of patriarchy and white supremacist values in being on time. And we're also working in the world. So how can we navigate that in a way that feels true to the values that we're trying to create? I mean, I think about like island time and stuff. Like, I just don't know if I lived in Hawaii, any client that I ever have in Hawaii, like it's always a very fluid sense of time that I can't always accommodate. I think it's worth it's added a richness to my thought process in it.
I'm glad you brought it in. I don't know. I still don't know why time came up for me in this chapter on white entitlement and white schools and parents. I'm going with it. And I am just really loving that it came up for you too. And I don't want to be too on the nose, but it's 6:58. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can offer final thoughts to each other.
Let me take a moment to think about that. Final thoughts. I think the line that I'm thinking about, the connective line, the connective tissue for me, is capitalism, commodification, and what it creates in us. How to work within a system while changing a system when not everybody's playing the game with the same set of values. So I think those are the things that I'll probably take away and continue to talk about and think about this week.
I like that you're coming away with like, these are my big questions and not these are my big answers. I appreciate that.
Do I ever know the answer?
You know a lot, so that's something. Trying to think. Full thoughts. I'm just kind of struggling to pick one. I think that for me, I really loved that you found Sonia Renee Taylor's Call In, Call Out, Call On. I'm going to be sitting with Call On for a long time, and her distinguishing of like positionality to the action, and her statement right at the top of the video, which is, we don't create distinctions around the reason we are communicating. Are you kidding me? Come on, little conflict Buddha. I love it. And so I appreciate calling on, adding that to my lexicon, and we'll be thinking about that for a while.
All right. Onward.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you. You are a beloved human. Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon.